Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Fortified, Inspiring, Storming, and of course Prideful. So this is two of the new 3 affixes that were added in Shadowlands, and it's actually shaping up to be a pretty good combination of affixes in my estimation for the purposes of timing high-level keys. I think that groups are going to have a lot of success this week because these are affixes that don't add necessary time or health or damage to the dungeon that can't be counterplayed against in an effective way, right? Inspiring does to some extent. That's the affix that slows down the dungeon the most of this, but Storming, for instance, if you dodge it or if you face tank it as long as it's not at the worst times, it doesn't actually slow down your dungeon at all, right? Compared to something like Grievous, that's just always going to add a tremendous amount of damage to any given dungeon, or Bolstering, which forces you to reprioritize your damage and punishes you with a lot of extra health if you fail that. This week doesn't really do too much of that, so I think you're going to see a lot of fairly high keys done this week. But I think that for an average group, particularly if your group contains melee DPS, this week is not going to be an easy week. It's not going to be an easy week for pugs either, because typically, you've got a couple melee in your group, so Storming is going to be causing you problems, and Inspiring is actually a pretty coordination-intensive week. So I think you're going to see a bit of a split between the top-end, players that'll be, I think, have this as one of the better weeks, and the mid-tier-ish weekly key, where things are a little bit less coordinated. I think there you're going to find this week it's not a bad week by any stretch, but it'll be a lot less, this is one of the best weeks on the calendar. With that being said, we do have a sizable set of nerfs coming in, mostly aimed at tank damage. So the damage incoming towards tanks, particularly from mobs that hit the tank especially hard, has been lowered in a lot of cases by a pretty substantial amount. Almost every dungeon has some changes on this list, and as we go dungeon by dungeon, I'll bring those up. There's also been a change to the Tyrannical affix, which of course, not relevant this coming week, but it will be relevant the following week, so that'll be something I'll talk about more in the next edition of this series. For now, though, let's get started going by dungeon. Take a look at my routes here. If you're interested, you can grab these from Raider.io every week on the weekly route series. I've got a route with skips and a route without skips that can be imported into your Mythic Dungeon tools. Link will be in the description below for those. And we can get started, I guess, with The Other Side. The Other Side, this is a dungeon that I actually think is fairly good for this week compared to average weeks. The timer in here is still one that, particularly as your key starts going high, is going to be something you might run into. This is one of the dungeons that I think, even when it was buffed to have a longer timer at the start of this expansion, it's still one of the ones that feels like it's just a tight timer a lot of times. Taking a look at what's changed in The Other Side this week, we have Headless Client auto damage and discharge damage, the Metallic Jaws from Arf Arf, and the Attalai Deathwalker. So changes to the Mechagon Wing, somewhat substantial here, and Woof also not targeting tanks should make the area a little bit less lethal for tank players. Not huge changes, I'd say, in this dungeon. I think one notable thing to me is that they didn't touch any of the Bladebeak Matriarch stuff that was going on in here. I think this is still going to be a pretty scary spot for your tank, so continue to look out for that. Another thing I want to call some attention to is the casts in this area. So you've got the High Priests and the Hoodoo Hexers in this wing, and it's actually, they have pretty similar kits in terms of what they'll cast, but there's actually a pretty big difference in terms of how much healing their abilities do. So Healing Wave's base heal is for 130k, and the High Priest's heal is only for base 20k, so it's like a very small fraction, right? A seventh as much as the Hexer's heal, which means that if you have to let a heal through, it's not that punishing to let one of these heal casts go through. It usually will heal them up for like 10 or 20% of their health. But if you allow a Healing Wave to go through, it's going to top a lot of enemies. So you want to make sure you're kicking this. And it's pretty annoying given that if the Inspiring was on the other foot here, this pull would be a lot easier. The way it is now, you kind of need to make sure you have a plan for being able to kick this Healing Wave cast, or else this pull will be slower than just pulling this thing in later. All right, Halls of Atonement up next. Halls of Atonement is the only dungeon to be absent from the list of dungeons that are receiving nerfs, and I think that's pretty reasonable. I think this dungeon is one where things were already pretty... Like, if you ask me what one of the most overtuned mechanics in this dungeon was, it would be the tank damage of, say, these bears here, the Vicious Gargons. But even still, I think this is a reasonable dungeon to leave untouched, and there's not too much else going on. Like, I mean, so if we look at their reasoning behind doing these nerfs, their stated reasoning is they want to make it so that tanks spend less time running away and more time actually tanking. My suspicion is that you're going to continue to run away from these things rather than actually tanking them. But there's only a couple packs of them in the dungeon. You're only fighting, what, 5 sets of Gargons? 6? I guess there's quite a lot of Gargon pulls, so maybe that's something they should look into. This is a dungeon where I think it would be reasonable to buff some of the other parts of the dungeon and tone down the Gargons a little bit. Other than that, pretty fantastic week for this place. Not too much going on that I feel is necessary to point out. Let's move on to Mists of Tirna Scithe, which also received a relatively light change here, which is just the Drust Soul Cleavers. The Drust Soul Cleavers are these guys in this pack, and they do the Soul Split, which does a boatload of damage and is a damage taken increase on your tank. And they've reduced the upfront damage here. It's still pretty nasty, and you're still pretty heavily incentivized to kite because it does come with the damage taken increase, but it is going to be a little bit less immediately killy. Mists of Tirna Scithe, also not a dungeon that I have too much to say about this week. So, yeah, let's move on. No need to stick around here too much. Let's go on to Plaguefall. Plaguefall, we have the Rotting Slime Claws, Corroded Claws. I'm a little bit surprised there aren't some more changes to what are they? The Plague Borers, the Wretched Phlegm is something that is pretty nasty. I'm a little surprised to not see some more reductions in the brutality of, say, the Plague Rocks, or I guess the Spinebreaker's probably fine, but this is an area I'm kind of expecting to see some more tank damage nerfs as the expansion goes on. Although, it kind of makes sense that this area is fairly lethal because it's also lethal to the enemies, right? You can explode the plague bombs on the plague borers and kill a lot of stuff. That's what my route with skips kind of relies on doing to speed this area up a little bit. But this is a breakpoint, I think. There are some groups that can do this whole thing in 2 minutes, and then there are some groups that get in here and wipe once or twice because of how nasty these mobs are, particularly if you fail to land the barrel explosions or the plague borer explosions. So try to land those. Inspiring shouldn't throw too much of a wrench into these things because there's none of the stuff you might want to CC or whatever should be too bad here. This is the one spot where if you want to save this plague borer, you're going to need to separate it from the plague binder and then CC it. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do this. You just need to have a plan. Abilities that are really strong against this would be Death Grip on the Inspiring mob here to then land the CC on the plague borer, or taunting this so your tank is running in and another player taunts this and runs this way, and then you can CC it over here and kill the rest of the pack over on the barrel, for instance. Okay, so that's Plaguefall. Let's do Sanguine Depths, which we have several nerfs here. The initial damage on the Chamber Sentinel's Severing Slice has been reduced. This was actually an ability that didn't matter too much for high-end groups because your tank could actually leap away from this and avoid it entirely. But I think it is a reasonable one to nerf because it was just pretty brutal for players that couldn't do that or weren't able to. I think it was very punishing. Frenzied Ghouls cast Shadow Claws less frequently. This is another. These mobs continue to murder tanks and will continue to murder them. Whether or not they're casting these Shadow Claws, they're pretty brutal, but definitely some of the harshest mobs to tanks in the expansion. So a good target there. And then reduction on both the damage and the frequency of slam from the Insatiable Brute. So all in all, reduction in the difficulty of trash in this dungeon. Pretty welcome on a Fortified week. My suspicion is that this one, when we get back around to Tyrannical as well, the Tyrannical nerfs, we're starting to get this dungeon into a place where it's a lot more reasonable than it was a couple weeks ago, prior to all these nerfs to its bosses and its trash. My suspicion is it's still going to be one of the harder ones on the calendar, especially because just most affixes are kind of trickier in here due to the narrow confines of this dungeon. These new affixes they've made, Storming, for instance, It's a lot nastier when you're in a 3 foot wide corridor than when you're in a nice open field like all of Halls of Atonement is, basically. Okay, let's do Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension, we have Ether Divers are going to cast Insidious Venom less frequently. That's these guys over here. You mostly encounter them when you go left, and I think it's a pretty welcome change. The Insidious Venom was pretty brutal, and it was on a pretty short cooldown, so I don't know how much less frequently they're going to cast, but that's a good one. I wonder if they fixed the thing where these two evade when you pull them for like 5 seconds, then they snap down to you. That would be cool to see. And let's see, there's another change, right? Yeah, the Forsworn Kyrian's Dark Lash cast time has been increased to 2 seconds from 1.5. What's a Forsworn Kyrian? Is that just all the Forsworn? Okay, so it looks like Dark Lash is a spell held by several of the different Forsworn Kyrian in here. That's why they said Forsworn Kyrian rather than any of their names. The Castigators, for instance, have it, and it just just does some damn. So a little change there. Nothing too impactful about these dungeon changes. The Ether Diver change, I think, is a pretty welcome one that should make this dungeon a little bit easier on your tank if you do go left, which I continue to recommend, although I think going right is a perfectly valid strategy as well. I think going left makes it a little bit more straightforward and has a little bit less pulls that are inherently high coordination, like a double Goliath pull. So that would continue to be my strategy in Spires. Let's check out Necrotic Wake. So here we have a Bone Flay from the Bone Carvers. This is the biggest nerf we have here, a 70% reduction and a duration reduction down to 10 seconds. So I wonder if this is damage per tick or total damage, because if this is just total damage reduced by 70% and the duration is reduced at the same time, then it'll tick. It won't actually tick for that much less, right? But if it's damage per tick is being reduced and its time, then the total damage this represents will be a lot smaller. So yeah, the Bone Carvers, they are these guys, and they were pretty nasty for your tank. I recommended pulling them before. I think they're going to be even better to do now. I think these are going to be nice targets to go for. You might not even have to kite anymore when you've got the 2 Bone Flays on you. So we'll see how that works out. Fix an issue where okay, so this is why they're reducing the damage on it, because its damage was reduced by armor. So actually it's going to hit for like the same. And in fact, if its total damage has been reduced by 70% and the duration has been reduced by 10 seconds here, this might actually hit harder per tick. You might die a little bit faster to this if it's not being reduced by armor and its damage is being dealt in a more condensed frame. So actually maybe watch out for that thing. And you're getting less gruesome cleaves as well. So all in all, not too much changing about this dungeon. It's going to continue to be one where good weapon usage is pretty important. Setting up good weapon pulls in this dungeon with Inspiring active can be tricky. It can be tricky to be safe, when you're normally relying on the silence or mostly the AoE silence from the anima orbs that you find like here and here. If you're relying on that and you have an Inspiring mob in the pull, you might need to rethink that strategy. But overall, I think still one of the better dungeons. Even if you just take those weapons and like use them on mostly bosses or mini bosses or like the very hardest trash pulls that you find here, rather than trying to use them to combine and do some kind of massive pull. Okay, Theater of Pain, our last dungeon here. Let's go have a little look at this one. So what's changing here? Unyielding Contender's Vicious Strike damage, 20% reduction, and the Ossified Conscripts are going to cast less Cruel Slash. So I would describe these changes, and pretty much all the ones here, as fairly, a lot of them are fairly small. Some of these changes, this one in particular, like the Sanguine Depths one, were pretty large, but for the most part, I think that this is not going to change the game in the way that they kind of hint that they might intend here, where tanks are kiting a lot. My suspicion is that just the auto attack damage of every mob needs to maybe be toned down by, I don't know, 5 to 20% if you want tanks to be standing in and fighting trash. Because I don't actually see how these are going to change that metagame so much. But if there's a pull that's very close, very almost doable, this might make it doable. And if you are somebody who doesn't like kiting, this makes it less bad to not kite, which is definitely nice. Theater of Pain, in terms of the affixes that we're looking at here, I think that it's not too bad. This pull in particular is a pretty nasty inspiring one, but these are the guys that were nerfed, right? The ossified conscripts by a little bit, so this pull is a really nasty one, but it's one that got the most, that will actually be easier as a result of those changes. I continue to recommend this strategy after going through several different strategies. My strategy, if you're willing to do some U-turning, is to clear out Zav first, then go do the first 2 pulls of the Blightbone area. Is this Blightbone? Is this what this guy called? No, Gorechop. Why do I think Blightbone? You do these 2, and then you U-turn and you go do Kultharok, and then you finish off Gorechop. And by doing that, you facilitate a Pride onto every boss, except for the first and last boss in this dungeon, which is pretty nice. If you would rather not do it, though, you can just use the no-skips route, which it's not technically a skip, but it is a U-turn, which is maybe a little bit too much to convince your pickup group to do. And this, you're just going to get Pride onto Zav and Gorechop, and forego it on Kultharok. You're just going to do the wings 1 at a time. 1, then 2, then 3. Anyways, that's a quick look at the dungeons this week. I expect that in terms of overall difficulty, they will mostly be about the same relative to each other as always. I don't really have any picks for dungeons that get particularly harder from these affixes compared to the others. So, yeah, that's it. It's nice that Inspiring is on the same guys every time it shows up as well. It's nice that there's not like a different set of Inspiring mobs on these different weeks. Anyways, hope this video helped. Let me know if it did. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Ratnos, and thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.